The observatory tower stood as a silent sentinel above the sleeping kingdom of Aurelian. Inside, royal astronomer Elena Voss peered through her telescope, her breath catching as she tracked the blazing object cutting across the night sky. This was no ordinary falling star, its trajectory was too controlled, its glow too steady. She hastily recorded its coordinates, her quill scratching frantically against parchment. "It's going to land," she whispered to herself, calculating quickly. Northwestern forest, near the Crystal Lake. Elena gathered her instruments, wrapping them carefully in velvet cloth. Dawn was still hours away, but this couldn't wait. Queen Marisol had specially requested immediate reports of any celestial anomalies after the recent string of strange occurrences throughout the realm, livestock behaving erratically, unusual weather patterns, and citizens reporting vivid shared dreams. The castle corridors were quiet as Elena made her way to the queen's chambers, her footsteps echoing against stone walls. 2 guards stood at attention outside the ornate doors, their expressions unchanging as Elena requested an audience. "Her Majesty left orders to admit you at any hour, Lady Voss," the guard said, opening the door. Queen Marisol sat at her desk rather than in bed, as if she'd been expecting the disruption. Her long silver-streaked hair fell loose around her shoulders, and she wore a simple night robe rather than her usual regal attire, yet her presence remained commanding. "You've observed something," the Queen stated, setting aside a document bearing the royal seal. "Yes, Your Majesty. An object of unknown origin has descended into the northwestern forest. Based on its trajectory and luminescence, I believe it to be not of our world." The Queen's eyes sharpened with interest. "You believe this connected to the disturbances we've been experiencing?" "I cannot be certain without examining it directly," Elena replied, "but the timing suggests a correlation." Queen Marisol rose, moving to a large map of the kingdom spread across one wall. "This could be the evidence we've sought. King Alaric remains skeptical of my concerns, but perhaps this will convince him that the kingdom faces a threat beyond our understanding." She traced a finger along the map to the location Elena had described. "You must investigate immediately. I'll assign you my personal guard." Elena tried to hide her surprise. The Queen's personal guard was comprised of elite warriors, rarely assigned to scientific expeditions. "Your Majesty, perhaps the royal scientists would be more appropriate." "This matter requires discretion, Lady Voss. I trust you implicitly, but these are uncertain times." The Queen pulled a small bell from her desk drawer and rang it gently. Within moments, a woman entered the chamber through a concealed side door. Elena had seen the Queen's personal guards from afar but never this close. The woman stood tall and lithe, dressed in fitted midnight blue attire that allowed freedom of movement while providing protection. A silver insignia of the royal house gleamed at her collar. "This is Commander Lyra Noctis," the Queen introduced. "She will accompany you to investigate this phenomenon and ensure your safety." Lyra bowed slightly, her movements precise and efficient. When she straightened, Elena caught her first real glimpse of the guard's face. High cheekbones, deep amber eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in an instant, and a small scar that traced from her left temple to her jaw, a face both beautiful and formidable. "We leave within the hour," Lyra stated, her voice surprisingly melodic for someone whose profession involved calculated violence. "I'll prepare horses and supplies." As they made preparations through the pre-dawn hours, Elena found herself stealing glances at Lyra. The guard moved with a fluid grace that contradicted her obvious strength. There was something magnetic about her presence, a quiet intensity that made Elena simultaneously comfortable and unsettled. By the time they rode out through the castle gates, the first blush of dawn painted the horizon. Elena felt a strange fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with the impending discovery and everything to do with the woman riding beside her. A woman who, despite their brief acquaintance, seemed oddly familiar, as if they had known each other in some distant, forgotten life. What neither woman noticed was Queen Marisol watching their departure from her tower window, a knowing smile playing across her lips as she clutched a small, pulsing amulet hidden beneath her robes. The forest thickened around Elena and Lyra as they ventured deeper into the northwestern woods. Dappled sunlight filtered through ancient trees, casting shifting patterns on the forest floor. They had been riding for hours, the comfortable silence between them occasionally broken by Elena consulting her navigational instruments. "We're close," Elena announced, dismounting from her horse. She pulled out a small device of her own invention, a brass contraption with swiveling dials that detected unusual energy patterns. "The readings are growing stronger." Lyra dismounted in one fluid motion, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of her sword. "I'll secure the perimeter." As Lyra moved silently through the underbrush, Elena found her gaze lingering on the guard's retreating form. There was something about Lyra that demanded attention, not just her physical prowess, but a quality that seemed to draw Elena like a compass needle finding north. "Focus," Elena muttered to herself, returning to her instruments. They found the impact site in a small clearing, a perfect circle where all vegetation had been flattened outward, as if bowing to the object at its center. The object itself was smaller than Elena had anticipated, roughly the size of a chest, with a metallic surface that shifted colors like oil on water. "Don't approach," Lyra commanded, placing herself between Elena and the object. Elena nodded, though scientific curiosity pulled at her. "It's emitting energy unlike anything I've documented before." She adjusted her instruments, recording measurements with meticulous precision. "Not heat, not light, something else entirely." As twilight approached, they established camp at a safe distance. Elena insisted on maintaining observation through the night, and Lyra arranged their sleeping areas so that she would always be positioned between Elena and potential danger. "The Queen has taken a special interest in your work," Lyra commented as they shared a simple meal by firelight. "She rarely speaks of scientific matters with such enthusiasm." Elena looked up, surprised by the personal observation from the usually reserved guard. "Her Majesty has always supported my research, even when others at court found it unconventional." "Like King Alaric?" Lyra asked, then immediately tensed as if regretting the question. Elena chose her words carefully. "The king values practical applications. The Queen sees the potential in discovery for its own sake." Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the tension that existed between the royal couple, known to everyone at court but never discussed openly. That night, Elena woke to find Lyra standing watch, her profile silhouetted against the moonlight. The guard turned, somehow sensing Elena's awakening despite her silence. "The object changed while you slept," Lyra said quietly. "It opened." Elena hurried to join her, bringing her instruments. The metallic surface had indeed transformed, revealing an interior that pulsed with gentle, hypnotic light. Within floated what appeared to be a gelatinous entity, translucent and shifting in form. "Impossible," Elena whispered, her scientific mind racing to categorize what defied categorization. Over the next 3 days, they studied the entity, establishing a routine that brought them into increasingly close proximity. Elena noticed how Lyra's stoic demeanor softened when they worked side by side, how their hands would occasionally brush, sending inexplicable warmth coursing through her veins. On the third evening, as they documented the entity's reactions to various stimuli, Elena realized the entity seemed to respond most dramatically when she and Lyra were closest to each other. The pulsing light intensified, and the patterns within the gelatinous form became more complex. "It's reacting to us," Elena concluded, reviewing her notes. "Or more specifically, to emotional states." Lyra frowned. "What kind of emotional states?" Before Elena could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Royal guards appeared through the trees, accompanying Queen Marisol herself. The Queen dismounted gracefully, her eyes fixed not on the two women but on the pulsing entity behind them. "You've made a discovery of great significance," she stated, approaching the object with none of the caution Elena and Lyra had maintained. As the Queen reached toward the entity, Elena noticed something strange, an amulet around Marisol's neck that seemed to resonate with the entity, both emitting the same shifting colors. "Your Majesty," Elena began, concerned, "we haven't determined if direct contact is safe." The Queen withdrew her hand, but her eyes remained hungry. "You will transport this back to the castle. I've had a special laboratory prepared in the Eastern Tower, away from prying eyes." That night, as they prepared for the journey back to the castle, Elena found Lyra standing alone by the forest's edge. "You've served the Queen for years," Elena said, joining her. "Have you ever seen her like this before?" Lyra hesitated before answering. "Not exactly. But there have been moments. Times when her interest in certain matters seemed to consume her." "And the King knows nothing of this expedition?" "The King is occupied with the northern border disputes. He won't return for at least a fortnight." Something in Lyra's tone made Elena look more closely at her companion. In the moonlight, with her guard lowered, Lyra appeared vulnerable in a way Elena hadn't seen before. "What troubles you?" Elena asked softly. Lyra turned to face her, their proximity suddenly intimate. "I'm sworn to protect the Queen and execute her commands without question. But I also find myself concerned for your safety in this matter." "My safety?" "There's something about this entity, about the Queen's interest in it." Lyra's voice trailed off. "I've never felt torn between duty and other considerations before." The air between them seemed to vibrate with unspoken meaning. Elena felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to bridge the small distance between them. Instead, she took a deliberate step backward. "We should rest," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tomorrow will be challenging." As Elena retreated to her sleeping area, she missed the look of longing that crossed Lyra's face, a mirror of the one she herself had carefully hidden away. The Eastern Tower laboratory became Elena's world in the weeks that followed. Queen Marisol had spared no expense in its preparation. Rare equipment from across the realm filled the circular room, and large windows offered expansive views of the kingdom below. The entity resided in a specially constructed containment chamber at the center, its pulsing light casting ethereal shadows across the stone walls. Lyra remained assigned as Elena's protector, a development that both thrilled and unsettled the royal astronomer. They fell into a pattern of intense work during daylight hours, when court officials and servants might interrupt with messages or supplies. Nights, however, belonged to them alone. "It responds to emotional resonance," Elena explained one evening, demonstrating how the entity's luminescence intensified when subjects reported strong feelings. Particularly emotions that are suppressed or unexpressed. Lyra leaned closer to examine Elena's meticulous notes. "That explains the Queen's interest." Elena looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Lyra lowered her voice, though they were alone in the tower. "The royal marriage has been strained for years. Political necessity rather than affection. The Queen has many thoughts she cannot express, feelings she must contain for the sake of the realm." "And you? What thoughts do you contain, Commander Noctis?" The question escaped before Elena could reconsider its propriety. Lyra's amber eyes met Elena's, something unguarded flickering within them. "Everyone at court wears masks, Lady Voss. Even scientists." Before Elena could respond, the laboratory door opened, revealing Queen Marisol. She visited frequently, always unannounced, always alone, and always after the court had retired for the evening. "Your progress report intrigued me," the Queen said, moving directly to the containment chamber. The entity seemed to respond to her presence, swirling more rapidly. "You believe it can not only detect suppressed emotions but potentially influence them?" Elena nodded carefully. Preliminary tests suggest it may amplify existing emotional states, particularly when subjects are in proximity to the object of their feelings. The Queen's fingers traced the glass of the containment chamber, her amulet glowing in response. Fascinating. And have you tested this theory personally? The question hung in the air, laden with implication. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks. We've maintained scientific objectivity, Your Majesty, Lyra interjected smoothly. Lady Voss has developed monitoring equipment that allows observation without personal involvement. The Queen smiled, though the expression didn't reach her eyes. Commendable professionalism. However, I wonder if first-hand experience might yield more accurate results. She turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. I'll return tomorrow evening. Perhaps we can discuss a more comprehensive demonstration. After the Queen's departure, a heavy silence filled the laboratory. Elena busied herself with adjustments to her equipment, acutely aware of Lyra's presence behind her. She suspects, Elena finally said, not turning around. Suspects what? Lyra's voice was closer than expected. Elena forced herself to face the guard. That there's something between us. Something we haven't acknowledged. Lyra remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Is there? The entity pulsed brightly in its chamber, responding to the emotional tension filling the room. Elena took a steadying breath. You know there is. I've felt it since the forest. This connection. It defies rational explanation. We've both ignored it, Lyra said quietly. For good reason. Have we? Or have we simply feared it? Elena moved closer, emboldened by the late hour and the entity's encouraging glow. The Queen will use this discovery for her own purposes. Whatever exists between us will become nothing more than experimental data. Lyra's composure finally cracked, vulnerability showing through. What would you have us do, Elena? I'm sworn to the Queen's service. You're dedicated to your research. For once, I don't want to analyze or study or observe, Elena whispered, close enough now to feel Lyra's breath. I want to experience. The kiss, when it finally happened, felt both inevitable and revolutionary. The entity's light flared brilliantly, bathing the tower room in pulsing radiance as years of carefully maintained distance dissolved in an instant of surrender. Neither woman noticed the Queen watching from the shadowed stairwell, her amulet glowing in harmony with the entity, a triumphant smile playing across her lips. The message arrived at dawn. King Alaric had resolved the border dispute early and would return to the castle by nightfall. Elena received the news with a mixture of dread and defiance as she stood at the laboratory window, watching the sun rise over Aurelian. Behind her, Lyra slept peacefully on the small cot they had begun sharing in recent nights. In sleep, the commander's features softened, the vigilant guardian giving way to vulnerable humanity. Elena allowed herself a moment to memorize the sight before gently waking her with news of the king's imminent return. We need to prepare, Lyra said, immediately alert, years of training overriding the momentary disorientation of waking. The Queen will want the laboratory secured before the king can discover it. Elena nodded, though reluctance weighed heavily upon her. The past week had transformed them both. What began as forbidden attraction had deepened into something more profound, conversations that stretched until dawn, shared dreams for a future neither had dared imagine before, touches that conveyed what words could not. The entity has changed too, Elena observed, approaching the containment chamber. What once appeared gelatinous now seemed almost crystalline, its shifting colors more vibrant, its responses more immediate. It's evolving through our emotional connection. Lyra joined her, their reflections superimposed on the entity's swirling surface. Do you think it's dangerous? Before Elena could answer, the laboratory door burst open. Queen Marisol entered with uncharacteristic urgency, her normally impeccable appearance showing signs of haste. The king returns, she announced unnecessarily. with unexpected companions, emissaries from the neighboring kingdoms. Elena glanced at Lyra, noting how the guard had automatically assumed her professional stance, all traces of intimacy carefully concealed. The ease of this transformation sent a pang through Elena's heart. "What would you have us do, Your Majesty?" Lyra asked, her voice neutral. The queen approached the entity, her amulet pulsing in response. The entity must be relocated temporarily. The king cannot know of its existence, not yet. Not until I understand its full potential. As they prepared for the relocation, Elena noticed subtle changes throughout the castle. Servants moved with unusual languor, their gazes lingering inappropriately on one another. Courtiers engaged in whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when others approached. The royal gardens, visible from the tower windows, hosted clandestine meetings between individuals who normally maintained careful distance. The entity's influence is spreading, Elena realized aloud as they carefully transported the containment chamber through a seldom-used corridor. It's affecting the entire court, amplifying suppressed desires. That's not possible, Lyra argued. The range should be limited to the laboratory. Unless something, or someone, is deliberately extending its reach. Elena's gaze fell meaningfully on the queen, who walked several paces ahead, her amulet glowing beneath her robes. They relocated the entity to an abandoned guardhouse in the castle's oldest section. As they secured it, the queen placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. "You've served the realm well, Lady Voss," she said. "But I believe your research would benefit from a change of perspective. I'm reassigning Commander Noctis to the king's security detail during the diplomatic meetings." Elena felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. "Your Majesty, our work is at a crucial stage. Which is precisely why a period of separation might prove illuminating," the queen interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "Distance will allow us to measure the entity's influence more accurately." That evening, as Elena worked alone in the relocated laboratory, the entity's light dimmed noticeably. She recorded this observation mechanically, her mind elsewhere, with Lyra, who now stood at attention in the great hall as King Alaric held court. The king, a broad-shouldered man whose formerly dark hair had silvered at the temples, commanded the room with practiced authority. Elena observed from the gallery, ostensibly present to document the atmospheric conditions as part of her regular astronomical duties. In reality, she sought glimpses of Lyra, positioned stoically behind the royal thrones. "The border disputes are resolved," King Alaric announced to the assembled court, "but troubling reports reach us from throughout the realm. Citizens acting in ways contrary to natural order and moral standing. Neighbors turning against neighbors over perceived slights. Families divided by unexpected confessions." Elena tensed. The king described exactly the effects she had documented from the entity's growing influence. "Something unnatural afflicts our kingdom," the king continued, his voice hardening. "Something that must be identified and eliminated." His gaze swept the court, lingering briefly on the queen, who maintained perfect composure despite the amulet glowing faintly beneath her high collar. Elena felt a chill of foreboding. Later that night, Elena returned to her regular quarters for the first time in weeks. The room felt foreign, the absence of Lyra's presence an almost physical ache. She had nearly drifted to sleep when a soft knock at her door jolted her alert. Lyra stood in the corridor, still in her formal guard attire. "We shouldn't be seen together," she whispered, even as she stepped inside. They embraced with desperate intensity, the forced separation having only strengthened their connection. When they finally parted, Lyra's expression was grave. "The king knows something is happening in the kingdom. He's ordered investigations, enhanced security. It's only a matter of time before he discovers the entity." "And us?" Elena asked, the question encompassing all her fears. Lyra's amber eyes darkened. "I've been instructed to maintain distance from you specifically. The Queen informed the King that your research has taken an unorthodox direction." She's using us as distractions, Elena realized. Sacrificial pieces while she pursues her own agenda with the entity. We need to separate, Lyra said, though her body tensed as if physically rejecting the words. For your protection. No, Elena replied firmly. Separation is exactly what the Queen wants. Don't you see? She's manipulating the entity's influence, using our connection to fuel whatever power she's drawing from it. Lyra stepped back, conflict evident in her features. My duty is to the realm's safety, Elena completed. As is mine. Whatever the Queen plans threatens that safety far more than our relationship ever could. As they formulated a plan to investigate the Queen's true intentions, neither noticed the small crystal embedded in Elena's doorframe, a fragment of the entity, placed there by the Queen herself, broadcasting every word of their conversation back to the royal chambers. Dawn painted the castle in golden light as Elena made her way to the relocated laboratory, determination hardening her resolve. The corridors were unusually empty, most of the court had withdrawn to their chambers, affected by strange dreams and overwhelming urges that left them disoriented and ashamed. The abandoned guardhouse door stood ajar. Elena paused, hand instinctively reaching for the small dagger Lyra had insisted she carry. Inside, Queen Marisol stood before the entity, which had grown to twice its original size. The containment chamber had been opened, allowing the entity direct contact with the air. Your Majesty, Elena called, maintaining a safe distance. The entity should remain contained until we understand its full capabilities. The Queen turned slowly, her face transformed by an almost youthful radiance. The amulet at her throat no longer merely glowed but seemed fused with her skin, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Understanding comes through communion, not observation, the Queen replied, her voice carrying strange harmonics. The entity has shown me truth, the realm suffers not from its influence but from the suppression that preceded it. Elena circled cautiously, noting how the entity's tendrils had extended throughout the room, some disappearing into the stone walls themselves. You've been amplifying its reach, she accused. Spreading its influence throughout the castle. Merely accelerating the inevitable, Queen Marisol smiled. For centuries, this kingdom has built its stability on denial. Marriages of convenience rather than passion. Alliances based on strategy rather than genuine affinity. Duties that crush natural desires. Her gaze sharpened as it fell on Elena. You understand better than most. What existed between you and Commander Noctis was beautiful precisely because it defied those artificial constraints. Was? Elena echoed, cold dread settling in her stomach. The laboratory door slammed shut behind her. King Alaric stood there, his expression thunderous, flanked by royal guards. Among them stood Lyra, her face an emotionless mask that failed to conceal the anguish in her eyes. The commander has confessed everything, the king announced. Your inappropriate relationship. Your dangerous experiments. Your corruption of the Queen's mind with this abomination. Elena's mind raced. Lyra would never have betrayed them willingly, which meant only one possibility, you used the entity to force her confession. I merely removed her resistance to truth, the Queen replied. As I'm doing for the entire kingdom. The entity pulsed violently, tendrils extending toward the newcomers. The king drew his sword, but before he could approach, Lyra broke formation, placing herself between the monarchs. Your Majesties, she addressed them both, her voice steady despite her evident strain. The entity doesn't reveal truth, it amplifies and distorts. What begins as genuine feeling becomes obsession. What starts as attraction becomes consumption. You speak of your own weakness, the king dismissed. I speak of what I've observed throughout the castle, Lyra countered. Guards abandoning posts for romantic trysts. Advisors revealing state secrets to win favor from objects of affection. The natural order collapsing into chaos. Elena moved to stand beside Lyra, their shoulders touching in silent solidarity. The entity feeds on emotional energy, she explained. It began with subtle influence but has grown powerful enough to control rather than merely amplify. The Queen laughed, the sound disturbingly musical. Control implies resistance. The court merely expresses what was always there, beneath superficial propriety. Then why did you need my amulet? The king's question silenced the room. He withdrew an identical amulet from beneath his tunic, its surface dull compared to the queen's glowing one. The twin amulets passed down through our bloodlines, meant to be worn by rulers who share power equally. Understanding dawned on Elena. The amulets were designed to contain the entity, not channel it. Two halves of a protective ward. A prison, the queen hissed, suddenly furious. A chain to bind what should be free. The entity responded to her anger, tendrils lashing out. Guards fell to their knees, overcome by its intensified influence. The king staggered but remained standing, his amulet providing partial protection. In the chaos, Elena grabbed Lyra's hand. The amulets together might restore the containment. They fought their way toward the king as the queen merged further with the entity, her form becoming translucent, suffused with pulsing light. The king's amulet brightened in response, creating a barrier of energy that deflected the entity's attacks. Your Majesty, Elena called above the psychic tumult that filled the room. The entity can be contained, but the amulets must be united. Not in conflict, but in harmony. The king looked from Elena to Lyra, their clasped hands a visual testament to their connection. Understanding passed across his face. Marisol, he called to his queen, his voice softening. We've grown distant over the years of rule. Political necessity separated what began in genuine affection. The queen's transformation paused, something human flickering across her features. You speak of ancient history, she said, though uncertainty tinged her voice. I speak of what remains, beneath duty and crown, the king replied, extending his hand with the amulet. We chose different paths but serve the same kingdom. Perhaps there remains a way forward, not in perfect union, but in respectful partnership. The entity writhed as the queen hesitated. Elena felt Lyra's hand tighten around hers, drawing strength from the connection as the entity's influence battered against their minds. Choose, Elena urged the queen. Not between power and weakness, but between destruction and transformation. For a breathless moment, the outcome hung in balance. Then Queen Marisol extended her hand, her amulet meeting the king's. Energy surged between them, creating a resonance that enveloped the entity. It contracted rapidly, returning to its original size, its wild tendrils receding. As the entity diminished, clarity returned to the room's occupants. The queen sank to her knees, the amulet separating from her flesh. The king knelt beside her, not touching but present. It offered what I thought I wanted, the queen whispered. Freedom from constraint. Pure emotional expression. Some constraints protect as well as limit, Elena said gently, thinking of her own journey with Lyra, how their forced restraint had deepened rather than diminished their connection. In the days that followed, the kingdom slowly recovered. The entity, now properly contained by both royal amulets, was studied carefully under strict protocols. Its influence, though potentially dangerous when unleashed, offered insights into emotional healing when properly directed. The royal couple established separate courts while maintaining a united public presence, acknowledging both their irreconcilable differences and their shared commitment to the realm's welfare. As for Elena and Lyra, they found themselves appointed joint guardians of the entity, a position that acknowledged both their scientific expertise and their demonstrated resistance to its more corrupting influences. Do you ever regret it? Lyra asked one evening as they observed the now dormant entity in its reinforced chamber. The exposure of our relationship? The loss of privacy? Elena considered this as she adjusted her monitoring equipment. I regret the circumstances, but not the outcome. What existed in shadow now exists in light. With appropriate boundaries, Lyra added with a small smile, gesturing to their carefully maintained professional demeanor within the castle walls. With chosen boundaries, Elena corrected, reaching for Lyra's hand when they were alone. The difference between imprisonment and choice is intention. Above them, in separate towers, two amulets glowed in synchronized rhythm, not merged but harmonized, maintaining balance throughout the kingdom. And within the entity's chamber, light pulsed in response to emotions freely acknowledged, contained but not denied. In the heart of the castle, balance had been restored, not through perfect unity or complete separation, but through resonance between opposing forces, each maintaining its nature while acknowledging its connection to the whole.